This conversation is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History, a project of the Michigan Political History Society. I'm Bob LaBrant, a past president of the Michigan Political History Society, and I'm here today to talk to Richard McLellan. Richard, since 1960, has been an active participant on the Michigan political scene. Richard, why don't we start out and just give us a little bit of biographical data as far as when you were born and a little bit about your folks.
Well, I'm about to be 72, so I was born in 1942. When I was 2, my mother took her a newborn baby, my brother and my older brother, and we went to Hawaii on a troop ship. We were one of the first groups of civilians to go back to Hawaii during the war. So I mentioned that I was in Hawaii during the war, and people say, "What war?" these days. So I lived in Illinois, Hawaii, came back to Indiana, moved to Mexico for about 6 months, 4 months, I guess. And then we went to Westfield, New York, and finally to Michigan. My father worked in the food industry, and so he would travel around a lot. So I lived in 11 houses by the time I was in 5th grade. But we settled in Paw Paw, Michigan, and I went 5th grade through high school in Paw Paw, where I really started being more politically active, I guess you would say, or active in policy issues, and then went to Michigan State on a journalism scholarship paid for by the Kalamazoo Gazette all 4 years.
Now, how did you get that scholarship?
I was active. I was editor of the yearbook and the school newspaper, and I had a very good journalism teacher that really mentored me and got me involved in writing and reporting, and I thought I was going to become a reporter.
Now, I also understand that you had an offer to go to the University of Michigan.
I did. I had a Regents scholarship too, but I forgot to accept it, and I thought I could just decide the last week which one I was going to. I didn't quite realize the significance of that. So I ended up with 2 scholarships, one from the Kalamazoo Gazette and one from Michigan State. So that's how I was able to pay for room and board as well as the tuition.
So you initially went to Michigan State to be a journalism major.
Right. I was a journalism major for about a year, and then I didn't think that was sophisticated enough, and I moved to communication science till they told me I had to do statistics, and I said, no, I do words. I don't do numbers. So I was embarrassed to go back to journalism, and I went into advertising, where my advisor put me in honors college where I could take anything I wanted, and the theory being that you will take more advanced courses, I simply took anything that started after 10 and before 3. So I took a lot of interesting courses like canoeing, communism, history of the Caribbean islands. 3 that come to mind. I always think of those as and of course I had no practical skill when I graduated then with an advertising degree and no advertising courses, and law school was the only choice, and I went to the University of Michigan Law School.
At Michigan State University, you met Peter McPherson, and he recruited you into the Young Republicans. Is that right?
About 1960, I remember. Peter was a year or 2 older than me, and so he got me involved, and then quickly got me involved in the Romney Volunteers, chairman of the Romney Volunteers for MSU. I think he saw me as somebody that they could use for political kinds of activities. And
so what sort of things would you do in that 62 campaign?
We would go to I remember I had lunch with George Romney at the Michigan State game. It was a campaign event, and so I thought I was going to have a nice lunch with him at the Union, and it was about 8 minutes that Romney was there, and they took the pictures and he was off, but I did have lunch with George Romney that time, and we did the usual campaign things. The other thing to show what a geek I was, the next year I was chairman of Students for ConCon when we had to adopt the new Constitutional Convention. Now, I will say that it was kind of hard to recruit for something like the Constitutional Convention among your average beer-drinking college student, but we helped turn out votes for that, and I got involved in the Ingham County Republican operation at that same time. So I pretty much have been involved with Republican Party politics ever since. I went to every national convention from 1960 on.
So you went to Chicago in 1960?
Yeah, I went to 60. I went to San Francisco in 64, Miami in 68, 72. I missed the one where Gerald Ford was nominated because I couldn't afford it. And then I've continued to go, sometimes with Governor Engler or then Senator Engler. And so I've always been active politically.
Back, just back on that April vote in 1963 that adopted the Michigan Constitution by a very narrow margin. I think it was only about 7,500 votes, and there was a statewide recount. But at least your career, your analysis of the Michigan Constitution has probably been, one of the major areas of your law practice, hasn't it?
Yeah, I got a job working for then Lieutenant Governor Milliken in '65, and the new Constitution was being implemented, and he asked me to do a study of all the executive branch agencies during the summer, that he wanted to write a book on the new structure of state government. So I had an opportunity to learn a lot of what's in the Constitution, but more importantly, what was in the Executive Organization Act that created the structure of government. And that's paid off for years because I actually know the history of how these departments came into force and used it in my practice and used it with governors, and particularly the governor's powers to reorganize, were something that I learned on my own back then, working for the lieutenant governor. And then when he became governor, I was on his staff, and I did a memo on the governor's powers under reorganization, which Governor Blanchard used. And then when Governor Engler was elected, a Blanchard official brought me that same memo that they had found in the archives. So sometimes what you do has a fairly long life, and that's what makes public policy interesting.
Let's go back to college. Probably one of your first patronage jobs was to be a janitor at the state capitol.
Janitor jobs were a political plum back then. We made $100 a week, which would be the equivalent of more than $600 a week now. They were generally given to the sons of the Speaker of the House or some powerful Democrat or Republican leader, but through a series of incidents, a good friend of mine got fired because Peter McPherson was a janitor in the Senate and basically was subcontracted to help do this House janitor's job, got caught. My friend got fired, Peter got sent back to the Senate, and I got the job because we all hung around together. So that's how I could first afford a car and help pay for those last years of school. And so that was my first job in the state capitol, as I frequently tell legislators that I was there. And then I eventually went on the lieutenant governor's staff, and then I went on the governor's staff. And so 3 different times I've been in the Capitol, starting with my very own mop bucket in a closet. Later on became the ladies' restroom. There was no women's restroom for legislators when I started.
I understand that when you were a janitor, you used the opportunity to arrange a meeting with Governor Romney about involving student leaders in Michigan politics.
Well, this was later on when I was in law school. A number of us were Republicans, and we recognized that the kind of people that joined the Republican Party, the students, were not the same as the student government types. And we felt that there was a lot of potential leaders there and we should reach out to them. So I called up and went up and saw the governor. And I said we had this idea, we want to have this statewide conference of student leaders for the Republican Party, and make it work, he would have to come and sponsor it, and he did, and he brought the lieutenant governor, and that was a very interesting project, and it did sort of begin to give me the contacts I needed, and then gave me the contact the next summer where I got a job with the lieutenant governor. So that meeting with Governor Romney, had some consequences for a long time since I.
So that led then to a meeting with Bill Milliken And you had a job with Bill Milliken, during the summer as a driver?
65 and 66. During 65 was not the campaign year, and then 66 I was a driver, and it was the campaign year, and I was supposed to go back to law school in August, and John Stalin, former Senator Stalin, was going to take over. Well, Stalin was sort of the governor's bagman and very good friend and a former senator, but he decided that he was going to go to Europe or something, and all of a sudden I had to continue to drive really through the campaign. So I didn't go to law school very much, and
Well, let's go back to the first day as a driver for the lieutenant governor. Tell us about that.
Well, I get this, I'm all excited, I have a new job. I had been coming across the street in Lansing, and I bumped into the governor's chief of staff, and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking for a job for the summer." He said, "Come with me," and went back, and they hired me as a summer intern and driver. So my first assignment was to drive to Kalamazoo, where the lieutenant governor was giving a speech to the regional Boy Scout conference, and all I had to do was drive him there and drive him back. I noticed we were a little low on gas and said, "I'll have to go get gas while he's speaking," but I got so geeked up in watching my new boss give a speech, I forgot, and we ran out of gas on the way home. That incident taught me to keep the gas tank full, but it also taught me a lot about Governor Milliken. We sort of rolled up into a parking lot of a car dealership, and the lieutenant governor said, "You know, my daughter is thinking about buying a car. Let me get out and look and see what they have here while you go get gas." I mean, you would have thought he would yelled at me and just said, "What kind of an idiot did we hire as an intern?" But he was always a gentleman, and that was an example, and that's why driving all over the state with the lieutenant governor, just he and I, gave me an opportunity to see one politician at work, a person who I continue to have great respect for. He and I perhaps have parted more on some political policy. He's a Rockefeller Republican, and I'm more of a more conservative on many issues, or more libertarian in some respects. But he's a great man, and he's one of the three governors I've really had the opportunity to work. Never had a job. He's the only one I ever had a job with, but to work with Governor Milliken, Governor Engler, and now Governor Snyder has been a great thing to make a lawyer who's interested in public policy have a pretty rewarding career.
Let's go back to your college days, because I think during that time you kind of demonstrated that you had a commitment from the beginning to free speech and the First Amendment. Tell us about your first. You attended a speech by Malcolm X on campus. Is that correct?
I did, and I was out there yesterday at the Kiva at MSU, and I still don't know why I went to it. I guess I just, it sounded interesting, and it was the first experience I ever had, having grown up in a small town that had a black population that had been there since before the Civil War, and you just didn't sense the racial challenges that were, really on the horizon in the 60s. But going to that Malcolm X speech, and for the first time hearing the kind of racist language from Malcolm X, who of course was from Michigan, formerly Malcolm Little, and the reaction of the black students cheering when he attacked white people. I mean, your basic naive northern white person thinks everybody gets along, and I began to learn at Michigan State the underlying racial tensions that I didn't even know existed, and they certainly do when we had people from the suburbs came to Michigan State. The whites and the blacks had very different views of things, and I was always quite involved in this, not involved, but always believed that this was silly that we'd have this discrimination. And I remember we put on in law school a Republican Civil Rights Conference and brought Hosea Williams, the governor, and lieutenant governor again were there. And I'd be hard pressed to think that the Republican Party today would have a civil rights conference, but things were different in the 60s. And Republicans played a key role in some of those issues, and I was active in some of that.
Back on the free speech movement itself on campus, there was an attempt by one group to bring the treasurer of the Communist Party of the United States on campus to speak, and he was barred, and that offended you.
Well, the socialist, young socialist invited this Communist Party guy, and President John Hanna banned him. But John Hanna was a great American, and at that time, communists were illegal. But I felt as a college student, I should be able to listen to anybody I wanted. I've always felt that way. So I called him up at Cowell's house at night, the president's, and I said, well, President Hanna, it's your university and you have the right to ban anybody you want. But we're students and we should have the right to hear anybody we want. So we're going to invite him to my college fraternity in the backyard. And we had 4,000 students show up and to hear this communist. Well, they probably would have had 40 people show up if they'd let him speak at the Young Socialist Club. But because they banned him.
Did you have beer at the fraternity for the speech?
Did I what?
Did you have beer?
No, we had no beer, but
Okay.
This was a pure political event. One of my fraternity brothers his father was head of the Teamsters Union in Battle Creek, and he was a flaming liberal Democrat, and I was a Republican, but we both believed in free speech. The next year, I was on the cabinet of the student government, and they changed the rules that you could speak on campus, but you had to have a permit. Well, that still offended us, so they invited SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the same group, Young Socialists. Well, we all got together, all the political groups, and said, we refuse to get a permit to let somebody speak politically. And we all then co-sponsored the speech by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating. So every political group had signed up as a sponsor. So they couldn't just go after the Young Socialists, they had to go on after all of us, which they did. But I think they realized that the end was near on that kind of in loco parentis, and we were put on, quote, strict disciplinary probation, whatever that meant. They did remove me from the student government council, whatever it was, but other than that, thereafter, again, in the 60s, thereafter they gave up trying to control speakers, and unfortunately now, many of those people have taken over the university, and the socialists and Marxists and so on are now deeply embedded in our higher education system, much to my chagrin. But they now keep out conservatives, which is interesting how free speech is something you have to continue to fight for.
Now, you ran for president of the student body at Michigan State.
I did. Peter McPherson sort of ran my campaign. Our theory was that while I was in a fraternity, I was sort of seen as a radical, and therefore I could appeal both to the frat community and the more liberal community. And there was 3 candidates, and I won the primary, but then the other 2 candidates got together and I got beat. So that year, Jim Blanchard won as senior class president. We're having our 50th anniversary dinner in 2014. The year before, he ran for student body president and lost. So that's the only thing with Jim and I, former Governor Blanchard and I, both have run for student body president at Michigan State, and both have lost. He went on to be more successful electorally than I ever was.
Now, were you two just acquaintances, or were you friends?
We weren't really friends in undergraduate, but in law school, we were both interns. I was an intern in the lieutenant governor's office, and he was the intern with the Democratic Secretary of State. So we would have lunch frequently over.
That would have been Jim Hare?
That was Jim Hare. And so I remember one day we were sitting there, and Jim Blanchard said, boy, you must have a really exciting job. I'm the summer intern in an off election year with the Secretary of State. I said, well, it's not quite as exciting as you think it is, but it was the lieutenant governor. And he said, I've never met Milliken. So I remember I took later Governor Jim Blanchard over to meet later Governor Milliken, and I introduced the two of them together, and we sat there, and I remember Milliken put his feet up on the desk and sort of talked to these 2 young guys about public service and so on. I don't remember what he said, but I remember the incident.
Well, Milliken would have turned the office of governor over to Jim Blanchard.
That's right.
And after the the election where he defeated Dick Headley, and then I guess at that time you were a law school student down at the University of Michigan, and Jim Blanchard was out at the law school at the University of Minnesota. So
yeah, that's right. We were at different law schools. We had been at Michigan State together, but we were at different law schools. But we both had these political internships in '65. And then Jim goes on fairly quickly to be elected to Congress and then ultimately as governor.
now you said that you didn't let law school interfere with your political activities.
Or my beer drinking. Yes, that was my rule, but that's true.
Were there any particular courses in law school that you had great interest in?
No.
Okay.
I took law school classes. I tend to be interested in almost anything. And I do remember two things. You have to take criminal law the first year, and I got a C+. And my professor was Gerald Israel. Gerald Israel was also the executive secretary to the Michigan Law Revision Commission. So about 15 years later, I am named chair of the Law Revision Commission. And Professor Israel is still our executive secretary. And every time we would go to a meeting, if I wanted to do something, Professor is, well, you know, Jason Honigman used to do it this way. And I always figured he just looked at me as a C+ student and that he didn't take me seriously as the chairman. And I finally told him, I said, Jerry, I'm the chairman of the commission. Jason Honigman is dead. You have to do it. He said, oh, okay. Okay, it was just, and I don't think it was because I had a C+, but I kept believing that. The other thing I remember was constitutional law, which right about that was when the Connecticut decision came down saying that a state couldn't ban contraceptives, which of course has been created the idea of privacy that has gone on to Roe v. Wade, gay marriage, the elimination of DOMA. This whole idea of privacy came out of that case, and that happened when I was in law school. And I remember we learned about that case, but you could never think through all the consequences of that. Similarly, some of the cases that I've seen First Amendment cases, which is my particular interest, political free speech, not freedom of religion or anything. I've seen 50 years of evolution of those kinds of legal principles.
In reading about Bill Clinton in law school at Yale, I noted that he often took off from Yale Law School to go run campaigns in Texas, and then came back and wrote final exams. Did it ever get to that point when you were working for Milliken in '66?
Yes, yeah, it did. Basically, I didn't go to classes, and then I came back and took the exams. I remember taking conflicts of law, and since I'd never been to the class, I had the exam, and all I did was I got the book, and I read it from cover to cover. Now, normally, a case book, you only read the cases that the professor assigns. But since I had no idea what was going to be covered, I had to read the whole case and the whole book, and I got a B+. I had another class that wasn't quite as successful, and that was tax, where Professor L. Hart Wright, a huge class of a couple hundred students, it seemed like, and I never went, and he disenrolled me without telling me. Of course, I wasn't there to know this, so I went up. So after the election, I wanted to go back for the last couple of weeks, and he wouldn't let me take the exam. And I was going to do the same thing, just read the book and take it, which I might well have flunked. And he wouldn't let me take it, so I had to go to law school, summer school the next year before I could graduate. Good news is I continued with student deferment longer, and then was able to get a postdoctoral student deferment, and that's how I avoided the draft, which was at the time, 66, 67, was the #1 priority of almost every college student.
So you had to deal with the draft board back in Van Buren County?
I did in Paw Paw. Margaret Graby. I'll never forget that woman. She wanted me to die on the fields of Vietnam because I was 25 years old, and she was drafting 18-year-old kids from Paw Paw, and our family had moved out of Paw Paw. she thought it was unfair. All my brothers and I kept going to college and my younger brother got a PhD and a law degree. My older brother got an MBA. And so I think she felt it was her duty to get us all drafted.
So this short period of time that you were a doctoral student, in what field?
Education administration. Because it is hard to believe that the Dean of Education at Michigan State was also the college Republican advisor back then. Now that would never happen today, I assure you. In fact, I just spoke this week to a group of education administration students, and where I was introduced as the Dark Prince. I was the primary opponent of the public education system. So it's 50 years later, I guess, almost.
So that lasted long enough to get you past your 26th birthday?
Right. I got to about 3 months shy of my 26th birthday, and then I knew they wouldn't have time to nail me by the time I was 26.
So you took the bar, and here you are, a new lawyer. You spent a short period of time working in a private law firm in either what, Weberville or Fowlerville?
Fowlerville. I got $40 a week or $50 a week, and then I got promoted to the chief assistant prosecutor for another $50 a week for the purpose of electing the prosecutor as a judge. And so I never tried a case. I think I went into court a couple of times, but that was my job basically. I then shut down the lawyer I worked for was also Justice of the Peace. So at the end of the year, 68, they shut down all the JP courts. So I was the chief assistant prosecutor. He was the JP, and we had hundreds and hundreds of files that had to be turned over to the
new district court.
So some of the tickets were half filled out. They weren't, they really couldn't be persuaded. So I created a motion in the interest of the economy and efficiency of government. The prosecutor hereby moves to dismiss this matter, and I put them on the printing machine, and we printed out a couple hundred of them and stuck them in the folders, and the judge approved them and sent them over to the new district court so they wouldn't have to open up new files on that.
So in 1968, Richard Nixon gets elected president. He basically appoints George Romney to his cabinet as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And your friend and later law partner, Bill Whitbeck, goes to Washington with Governor Romney to work at HUD. And he recommends you as a new lawyer to your old boss, the new governor, Bill Milliken, as far as public policy.
That's right. Bill recommended to Jim Kellogg, who was taking over the policy operation, and I was making about $10,000 a year, I guess, by that time, and he said ask for 14, and I met with the governor, and he said, okay, 14 sounds good, and I was made an administrative assistant for policies and programs. There's about 5 of us. We divided up all 19 departments, and the other guys got all the important departments, and then there was 9 left, and I was the only lawyer on the policy staff. So they gave me 9 departments, which turned out to be very much to my advantage, because the cabinet people had to call me before they would go see the governor. And so I've learned my lesson. You have to be in the flow of policy and the flow of paper and everything to really have clout within the governor's office. And so for a couple of years I did, and I learned an awful lot in those first 2 years. My secretary was a holdover from the Romney era, so she took me by the hand around to introduce me to these cabinet officials. And I was quite nervous, I mean, I had never met most of them, and I didn't have any idea how you'd deal with them, and I was young, and I had longer hair than a state police director thought I should have. And
So state police was under your
tutelage? It was on state police, military affairs, drug abuse. Then I also had Secretary of State and Attorney General. Secretary of State was a Democrat, and so we would get letters, people complaining about their license plate or whatever, and I had to prepare the responses. So we had a standard response. Dear citizen, thank you for complaining about the Secretary of State. as you know, he is under separate power, and I'm sure he will fix your problem. and we would just automatically, then pass it over to them. But we back then, the policy people, we had to do all the governor's correspondence. What I found the best way for me to get my ideas involved was help write the governor's speeches. Because the speechwriters always had too much to do. And again, I sort of a quasi-journalist, I was good at writing. I would wander down and talk to them, and I'd say, well, what do you got to write a speech about? Well, this or that. So what if I write a few paragraphs? So I was able to push some ideas about liberalizing marijuana penalties, for example, in the governor's speeches, because I knew how he worded things, because I had drafted letters for him when he was lieutenant governor. And he had a certain style of language, and you had to have rounded edges on things. And when you would be pushing something like marijuana penalties, you'd have to have some line about we're still going to enforce the law, but this is a health issue and we have to deal with it. And I knew how to articulate some things for him. Similarly, we had student riots on campus, and we would get boxes of letters. And I had to write an answer for the governor to all of those. And I remember having three piles. The people that said we should nuke the campuses and teach those kids a lesson. Another, the squish liberals that felt we should be more sensitive to their needs. And a very small stack of people that said, Governor, this is a very difficult issue. You've got to do something. So I drafted 3 letters that all reflected the governor's exact views, but with sufficient emphasis to try to appeal to the instinct of whichever stack of papers I was responding to.
In 1970, Bill Milliken runs for governor on his own, and he's up against Sander Levin, a state senator from southeastern Michigan. And it's a very, very close election, but Milliken pulls it out and is elected for a 4-year term. That Thanksgiving, there is something that is called the Thanksgiving Massacre. Could you explain that?
Yeah, the governor won a full term, and he decided he had become close to Jack Dempsey, who was a Democrat who was a strong supporter of his, and I think he'd been on television or something, but he had run for Congress and lost, but Jack Dempsey, he brought him in to replace Jim Kellogg as the head of policy. And then several different people were moved on out. For me, they told me I was going to be promoted upstairs from the basement of the Capitol where the policy people were to an office right outside the governor's. The governor said he wanted me there. Well, it was the worst thing that happened in my career because even though I had an office right outside the governor, nobody had to go through me. He also took my secretary and made her his secretary. And so I had this great office that people would come in and say, boy, this guy must be powerful. But I would just sit there and, twiddle my thumbs. And it was the new regime. I didn't really fit into it in a way that I had been. And so I came up with other issues that I could pursue on my own because nobody was really supervising me. I mean, the governor isn't going to check in and say, what's going on, Richard? And so I didn't report to anybody, but so I worked there 2 more years, and it was not as fun as being in the midst of the policy dispute. I did want to say something about that 1970 campaign. 2 things that, since money in politics is always very important, I remember 2 things. John Stalin came to me and one day, and he had a note, and I had to sign a letter to borrow $10,000 from the Belding Bank to pay for the campaign. And I had to, personally, I was paid $14,000 a year, and so borrowing $10,000. I said, John, do I have to do this? He said, yeah, you do, we'll pay it back, but they want personal guarantees. So of course I had a job, so I signed it. Later on, John Stalin, again, who was one of my mentors and a great guy, was talking about money. And they got some money from one of these mafia guys, $10,000. And since I was the governor's aide on organized crime, I said, well, you sent it back, didn't you? He said, well, I sent 9,000 back. I said, John, you can't do that. Well, I know, well, we need the money, $1,000. And I always thought, that's politics. And 10,000 would have been inappropriate, but, we needed 1,000, and we took that 1,000.
So there were no contribution limits, because we had no Michigan campaign finance.
Oh, yeah, there was,
Well,
yes.
we had a Corrupt Practices Act.
Yeah, no, we had limits. 68, we had limits. That's why I was chairman of People for Rockefeller, because there was limits, and Rockefeller created hundreds of committees, not unlike what we did later for John Engler in the Senate, created a whole raft of committees. So you did have these limits, and you would have to get around them by doing a lot of things. So, yeah, the limits, if
So
they
being
were,
the guarantor of a loan wasn't considered at that time a
no,
contribution.
I don't. And if it was, I don't know. What did I know?
Yeah.
It was later that I became expert on campaign finance, but not until after Watergate.
So you decide that it's time to leave state government and hang out your own shingle as Richard McLellan, attorney at law.
Yes.
Before you did that, though, you had to, you were, at least for a brief period of time, the drug czar of Michigan.
Right. I had been right from the beginning. In 1969, when I went on the governor's staff, there was no drug abuse program in state government at all. There was alcoholism programs for basically older white men. But the alcohol industry alcoholism people didn't want anything to do with drug abuse. They were black, younger, different drugs, and they thought alcoholism was special. Governor said, no, we have to start having a drug abuse program. So I remember met with him, and he said, well, I said, okay, Governor, we could create an office of drug abuse. Do you want it in the governor's office, or do you want it in the Department of Public Health? He said, why don't we put it in the governor's office? And I said, okay. So we created this office of drug abuse just by press release. George Weeks, the governor's press secretary, called me and said, there's a guy, I'm sending him down, Alex Lagas, hire him. Your job is to hire him. And I had some control over the crime control money. So Alex became the head of the Office of Drug Abuse, and he was just a reporter. We then took $10,000, I think, and we made a movie about the drug abuse programs around the state, that the governor would participate. He would go to a school, he would go to a hospital, whatever little programs that we could find, the governor would get there and he would talk about this program as if it was part of the state's effort. And I remember we made those movies. I'd love to see if one is still around, because that's what you did back then. There was no internet, no that sort of thing. But we basically created the state's drug abuse problem as a, smoke and mirrors for that to get off the ground. Then over the years, more and more money started to flow. So the governor, we ultimately drafted a bill called the Office of Substance Abuse Services, OSAS, and created a real agency. I was the last head of the Office of Drug Abuse for about the last 60 days or something, because whoever had it had moved on. And so then I did that, and then I left. And the new OSAS was created, and I left and went into private practice. So those kinds of issues, again, my experience, long-term experience, I can have seen these issues through the whole cycle. OSAS lasted 10, 15 years, and then it dwindled into the bureaucracy somewhere, and I'm sure the money is still being sent, but it's not very high priority anymore.
Before we leave the governor's office, well, let's just talk about a few personalities there. Were you knew Joyce Braithwaite quite
The Dragon
well.
Lady was the governor's. I knew her when she was the secretary to Ellie Peterson, the vice chairman of the Republican Party, because I worked for the Republican Party in 1963 in the summer. And so I knew Joyce.
That's when Bill Ballinger was
Bill
research
Ballinger
director.
was the research director, and I worked for the party. And because I worked for the party, I was able to use their print room for my ill-fated campaign for student body president. I remember one weekend we took all the paper that the Republican Party had, and back then you mimeographed things and you used the mails. Well, Ellie came in the next morning, and the whole paper room was empty. Well, we said, well, but Ellie, you said we could use some paper. It's a big campus. And she wasn't mad, she just, so that's what I did. So later on, I worked for the party, and then, what was the question?
Well, we were talking about Joyce Braithwaite.
Joyce Braithwaite. So the key players that I remember in the governor's office were Don Gordon, the first chief of staff, who had been his chief of staff as lieutenant governor, one-term legislator, I think. And Don then had to leave after the Thanksgiving massacre because they had offered a job to Jimmy Del Rio's girlfriend. And Don had to take the fall.
Tell our viewers a little bit about Jimmy Del Rio.
Jimmy Del Rio was a foundling, and he didn't know what his ethnicity was. So he would be variously Jewish, Hispanic, or black. And grew up and eventually was elected judge. And I think he was eventually removed, but he was a very good friend of my uncle's, and I got to be a good friend of his. He was one of these characters that, occasionally you would see, where most people, just think he's a crook and a crazy man, and he was, but he helped in 1970. The governor was in a very close race. There was two groups that helped him on the slide. The Teamsters Union, they published a newspaper for all the labor people. Never had any disclaimer on it, but it was the Teamsters that paid for it. And another group was, they put together a newspaper, and then they had a picture of the governor, and all around it was every black appointee that he had given. Because that was his big strategy. And it said, "We need this man." And that went all through the black community. Well, I think that's what Jimmy Del Rio and some other people put together for him. And of course, they were all Democrats, but they wanted Governor Milliken to win. And I have a copy of the labor newspaper, because Alex Lagas was involved in doing that. And so that's sort of one of those historical documents that is rumored to exist, and it does exist. The one that says, "We need this man," with all the black appointees, I don't know, maybe George Cushionberry has one, but it would be interesting from a political history point of view to see some of these documents. And of course, it points out that while Governor Milliken is about as straight arrow as you can get in politics, probably not everything that happened in 1970 meets today's standards of politicking.
In 1970, John Engler won in an upset over Russell Strange for the State House.
Yes.
Did you know John in that first term in the State House of Representatives?
I did because we were both pretty young, and that was 71, and I was then sort of on this new assignment with no assignment, and so I got to know John, and I was also pushing the marijuana penalties, and I remember talking to him about that. But he and I just seemed to get along, and politically, and he was quite unpopular with the governor and with Joyce Braithwaite. And I remember two occasions. One, I got a call from John Stalin, again, who was sort of my mentor, and he liked John Engler, but he said, "Richard, look, I'm just warning you. You are seen with John Engler too often, and you are a Milliken person, and this may not be good for you." And then one time, Joyce Braithwaite called, much more blunt, and said, "Look, Richard, you're one of us. You're hanging around with Engler, and I can tell you this, we're going to get him." And I sort of had to make a choice then, and John continued to be my friend, and I was one of his political allies all along. And I never sort of abandoned Milliken, but I felt that John was somebody that I respected, and he did try to totally disrupt Governor Milliken's control of the Republican Party. And so there was some reason for that kind of tension between them. But I think that I once, about 30 years later, I was up at Mackinac Island staying with the governor in the governor's residence, and it was foggy, and we had to drive back. We were going to fly back, but I had driven up, and his plane couldn't fly him back, so we decided we'd have the troopers drive my car. And the two of us went down early in the morning and got on the ferry boat. And on the ferry boat was Bill Milliken, Governor Milliken, who also had a place on the island. And I remember sitting there with John Engler, then governor, and he said, well, I should go talk to him. I said, yeah, you should. And he went over and during that ferry boat ride, he and Milliken talked. And when we were driving back, he said, that's the longest I have ever talked with Bill Milliken. Even though they were two Republican governors that, served, he served in the House and under Milliken, and I can't remember if he was served in the Senate, but anyway, yeah, he did. But there was not a lot of love lost between them.
Well, let's shift here and tell us a little bit about your decision to establish your own private practice.
Well, 1972, again, from 70 to 70 through 72, 71, 72, I was on the governor's staff, but I didn't have a lot going for me. And I said, well, at some point this sort of thing has to end. You got to go get a real job sometime. And by that time, I'd worked up to $20,000 a year, I think. And so I started to see about getting a job. So I interviewed at almost all the firms in Lansing. And every one of them said, well, you're a nice young man, but you're not a real lawyer. You've never been to court. And I said, well, no, I haven't. But, I wrote a lot of these laws. And I know how state government works. I think you'd think there'd be a position for that. Well, there wasn't in these firms. So my uncle was a lobbyist and had an extra office. So I just decided to go out on my own.
This was John McLellan.
John McLellan was an old, curmudgeonly old lawyer, had been close to the mayor, Mariani of Detroit. He represented Blue Cross in Michigan for a long time and was a pretty well-known lobbyist and lawyer and very controversial. Governor Milliken fired him from the parole board or from the tax commission while I was on the governor's staff. And I remember going to a cocktail party with the governor, and somebody came up to him and said, well, I'm glad you fired that McLellan guy. And Governor Milliken, and only the way that the governor he turned to me and he said, was this McLellan? And this guy was embarrassed. He didn't have any idea who I was. But, Uncle John was quite controversial, but he gave me an office, and I figured if I couldn't afford it, I could, he wouldn't throw me out after the first month. So I went out on my own, and I was very fortunate because I was kind of the first real lawyer lobbyist, I think, because many of the lobbyists were lawyers, but they didn't practice law. I was able to do both. And I got big clients within about 3 months, so I never had to go scramble for divorces and criminal assignments or anything like that. And I just had a very good high visibility practice right from the start. Now, that was also the time when right after Watergate. So you had all of these campaign finance acts being developed. And I told Bill Ganotke at the time, who was the House Republican policy guy and a good friend of mine, he tells me that I told him, I said, I'm going to know more about these laws than anybody else because they're new. And my theory was if you get on the ground floor of a law, you can beat these big shot lawyers that just hire their youngest associate to survey the law. They don't get the in-depth knowledge that I could get from where I was practicing. So I really worked to get to know those laws, and I would go to lunch at the City Club with my uncle, where all of these trade association executives would sit with him, and they would then all, pick my brain about these laws because they affected all of them. I remember the Chrysler lobbyist in particular would always ask me all these questions. And I finally told him one day.
Was this Todd?
Hiram Todd, wonderful guy, long-time lobbyist, wheeler dealer, and he asked me all these questions. And finally one time I said, Hiram, the free legal aid clinic is closing today. From now on, if you want to know about the Campaign Finance Act, you come over to the office and bring a check. And because I figured, Chrysler could afford, one of their in-house lawyers or me. And so I got involved in that. And as you know, Bob, I stayed with the campaign finance for a long time, and we both ended up in the U.S. Supreme Court arguing a campaign finance First Amendment political speech case. And those battles continue today.
Over the years, Richard McLellan, attorney at law, expanded into McLellan, Schleybaugh, and Whitbeck. And as you said, for yourself, you developed this kind of niche that you were going to be the expert in campaign finance law, the lobby law. You really, I think, you were one of the first lawyers, I think, in Michigan to look at this and say, this has now become a regulated industry, and just like lawyers can practice utility law, I can practice political law.
That's right. It is a regulated industry. It has all the elements of a regulated industry: complexity, heavy regulation, barriers to entry, criminal penalties to frighten people out of the system, just like we do when we license doctors or other people. We use the government to limit access. And so political activity is now not democracy in the way that some people would have you believe, but it is a regulated industry as much by the government regulation as it is by the increase in money. Now, it's also true there's enough money in it now that a few lawyers, and you know them all here in Lansing, make a living, pretty good living on ballot campaigns and elections and so on. But it is what it is, both nationally and in Michigan. It's a very complicated and specialized area of practice and specialized area of activity. You just don't have volunteers in campaigns anymore.
Also, Michigan, at least in the late 70s, moved to amend the Michigan lobby law, and you developed an expertise in that. I remember a famous chart that I think you produced on that. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the Lobby Act, again, it's a very complicated statute in what it defines as lobbying. Every word is defined. So lobbying is attempting to influence administrative or executive action, and so the executive action, administrative action, or legislate, all of it is defined. So anybody facing that law has to know all those definitions. Well, your average lobbyist, or frankly average lawyer, looks at that and it's very intimidating. So it was my business to hustle clients. So I had to speak at the Michigan Chamber, I think, and I took all those definitions and created about a 4-foot-long chart showing how this definition was hooked to this one. And I said, and I held it up and I said, this is what you have to do. This is what you have to understand to be in compliance with the law. It reminded me as an early version of the chart they made of Hillary Care, showing how complicated that system is, or if one could be developed a chart on Obamacare, which probably is not capable of being drafted. But it worked because I actually used it. And I knew I created it, and then it was in my head. And so I was able to do analysis and help people go through this maze of regulation, what you can do, what you can't do, and what you have to count, what you have to turn in. And it was part of the basis of building a real expertise in lobby regulation, as well as what I had already pretty much developed on campaign finance.
I recall we retained you, meaning not only the chamber, but the First Amendment Committee to Protect the Right to Lobby.
Right.
And you were one of 3 lawyers that we'd hired to challenge the constitutionality of that act in a case called Pletz versus Austin. Do you recall that case at all?
I do, and I always remember that Francis Pletz was head of the Library Association, and I thought it was a brilliant decision that I think Jerry Coombs and some other people made. We have to have this committee. We have to challenge the Lobby Act, and we can't have the president of the Michigan Chamber be chairman of this group. Who could we get? What lobby group is the least threatening to people? And they said, well, what about Fran Pletz, a wonderful woman who ran the Library Association. And she was a lobbyist for money for libraries. And she took it on with abandon. Plus, it was sort of a free speech issue. You know, should people be regulating in their political speech? And being a librarian, she had those instincts. So she was our front person, if you will. I remember they had some big-time law firms that were driving the choice, and I think they misspelled my name on the brief, but which frequently happened. And I learned later on, try to control the brief, and so at least they get your name right. And those kinds of issues were reflected the fact that there's 3 or 4 law firms that take on these kinds of issues. Sometimes they split between Republican and Democrats. Sometimes they all work together. But there's this very small fraternity of people that do this. And one of the people was Gary Gordon with the Attorney General, who was with the Attorney General for 30 years. And he eventually went into private practice and joined my then firm before I retired. And so he was able to join this small fraternity on the other side. He actually ended up writing a brief for the Attorney General in the Austin case that you and I lost in the Supreme Court. And he also drafted an amicus brief in the Citizens United case that we won. So he changed sides, and another decision came down. But also better lawyers and better justices. But after 20 years, the First Amendment was upheld in that controversial case.
Well, like in politics, litigation, it's all in the timing.
Exactly right, exactly right.
Tell us a little bit about how you and your partners, Rex Schleybaugh and Bill Whitbeck, decided to seek a merger with the state's largest law firm, Dykema Gossett.
We didn't. It was McLellan, Schleybaugh, and Whitbeck. Rex Schleybaugh's mother, Doris, had been on the governor's staff, worked with the Dragon Lady, Joyce Braithwaite. And when he got out of law school, Doris said, well, Rex is looking for a job. So I hired him, and then we formed McLellan and Schleybaugh the day he passed the bar. Whitbeck then came back and had worked for the state for a couple of years from George Romney in Washington. He went into practice, and we hired, and it was McLellan, Schleybaugh, and Whitbeck. Then we hired Al Ernst from the Attorney General's office. And he was sort of an energy guy that Bill Whitbeck knew. And Frank Kelly told him not to go to work for these guys. They're all just Republicans. They're just riding on Milliken's coattails. Minute Milliken is out, they'll be gone. Well, he decided to come with us. He was just mad because we didn't put his name on the door and we wouldn't give him a speakerphone. Only the partners got speakerphones back there. So Al always wanted that speakerphone. He's turned out to be one of the most successful lawyers in the state in the whole area of telecommunications and energy. So we built up that firm, and then one day we got a call from Brian Sullivan.
At Dykema.
At Dykema, he was the chairman of Dykema. Well, we had been representing the mobile home industry, and one of the major mobile home companies in Michigan had a Dykema as their lawyer. And Rex got to know that lawyer pretty well. He then told Brian Sullivan, who was just the new chairman, that Brian wanted an office in Lansing because Dickinson,
Miller
and
Canfield,
they all had an office in Lansing, and Dykema did not. So this partner told Brian, and Brian said, okay, I'll call these guys. So he called me up and got me on the phone, and he said, we'd like to talk to you about maybe, coming in with us. And would you like to come down to Detroit and we can talk about it? And I figured this was one of those times you either have to, do what they want or do it your way. And I said, well, Brian, we're really busy up here. Why don't we meet in Brighton, which was halfway. And a lot of times if you're going to go to Detroit, you'd meet in Brighton. And he agreed to do that. But he slammed the phone down. And he said, who do these people think they are? This little dinky firm in Lansing. They can't come down to see me. Well, I knew if we went down on his turf, he'd take us around on a tour and he'd, blow smoke at us. Whereas if we met him in Brighton, we could blow smoke at each other at least. And after couple months, we integrated our practice with Dykema. We didn't call it a merger, we didn't call it a buyout. But then thereafter, Dykema swooped in with all of their systems and their administrative people and their papers. And I remember the very first day, it was April 1st, was when we joined the firm. And the administrative partner, they would put out something called Dykema Daily, just, news of the firm. So we got our very first Dykema Daily. And the very first story was that they'd done a study of phone costs and had determined that people were using the Dykema phone system for personal calls. And everybody had to come down to the administrative office and bring a check for $6 to make, and I said, what? What kind of firm is this? Of course, it was an April Fool's joke. And I didn't know, we're brand new, and it was the very first thing we got. So a year later, Brian Sullivan said to people, he said, we thought we were getting geographic expansion, but what we got was entrepreneurial infusion because all four of us were very entrepreneurial. I mean, basically, to start a firm from scratch, you eat what you kill. And many of the Dykema Gossett partners were smarter than we were, but their whole practice development was their in-basket because they were young and they were smart and they would take over from some more senior partner. So Brian realized what we brought to the firm, and later on I went on the executive committee, and ultimately Rex Schlabach was chairman of the firm. So we had a good run in that firm, and I retired about 7 years ago. So I have no connection with the firm now.
About that time, you got involved in a campaign that was run under the slogan, D is dumb. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, one thing that's changed in the 30 or 40 years, there was a period of time when policy was driven by three big groups: business, labor, and the consumer groups. And the consumer groups were quite powerful. They had the support of the unions. And one of the issues that they would always fight about was utility rates. So the consumer groups put a ballot question on them that was to control utility rates. It would have bankrupted DTE, Consumers Power, and so on. So these groups got together and they hired, I think, probably one of the best political teams, Republicans and Democrats, to fight this campaign. They had all polling, they had Republican, Democrat, campaign managers, and they had me as their lawyer. And two things that we learned: there was a limit of $40,000 per ballot question committee. We knew we would have to spend millions. So I came up with this idea of a compliance and operations group, COG. It was not a committee, but it controlled committees. And through that model, we created hundreds of committees so that we could spend millions of dollars. I remember that.
Now, that kind of dates back to your Rockefeller days, huh?
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's where that kind of idea came from, that you never assume that these barriers that the anti-political people are throwing up will stop you if it's important enough. Figure out a way to do it. We then did polling and said, we are going to lose. There is no way we can win on this battle. It was just, this was going to pass. The utilities control the legislature. They could get the votes. So a decision was made to put another proposal on the ballot called H. And under the Constitution, if two ballot proposals cover the same thing, if they both pass and one has more votes than the other, it will take effect. So that was the strategy. We later used that same strategy in the bear hunting campaign. But we came up with this new amendment, got it adopted by the legislature, and then launched one of the most expensive campaigns in Michigan's history with one theme: D is dumb. Because there is no way you could run an ad discussing utility rates in a way that people would pay any attention to, and particularly drive their vote. But if you say 1,000,000 times, D is dumb, D is dumb, D is dumb. It sticks with enough people. And we won. We were way ahead, we felt. And then somebody figured out that we had created this cog. I had created the cog. And I'd come up with the idea, and it was operating. And they brought a complaint against us in the campaign finance. I told the utilities, I said, it's legal, I guarantee you. It's perfectly legal. But you could see the daily tracking polls. In the same way we never ran a campaign on the substance, they learned their lesson. Don't run a campaign on the substance, just beat up on the utilities. And fortunately, they brought it too late, and we squeaked by with a win, and H got more votes. D is dumb and dead. What happened thereafter, the utility CEOs, or the chairs of the, said, well, what happened? Why did we get this complaint filed? What did you guys do wrong? I mean, they won the election because of this idea, and they turned it down, and the general counsels, I learned my lesson about general counsels of companies. They immediately, it wasn't their fault, it was my fault, and I was expendable, so I got thrown under the rug, and my friend John Peerage was hired to defend the thing. And they brought a lawsuit on the same utilities. John brought it and ultimately won, and I never wanted him to win a case any more than that, and he did, and I was right. And this limit on ballot question committee expenditures was thrown out by the Sixth Circuit, I believe. So that was the most expensive campaign. It showed examples where we had the unions, the utility unions on our side. You had business, some labor, you had Republicans and Democrats all pulling together, and those are sometimes the most fun campaigns, where you do get to work with the other side to beat up somebody that you both decide is wrong. Most of the time it's Republicans versus Democrats or business versus labor, as has been the most recent kinds of fights over right to work and that sort of thing.
Well, later there was a challenge to the $40,000 contribution limit. The U.S. Supreme Court had spoken in a case out in California, Berkeley, and so the $40,000 contribution limitation was declared unconstitutional, and now there are no contribution limits as it relates to ballot questioning campaigns. Also, about this same time, I came to you with an idea to challenge the prohibition on corporate independent expenditures, and that started the lawsuit of Michigan Chamber of Commerce versus Austin, and as you've already relayed, that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In fact, that case went to the Supreme Court twice. We lost the first time, but then Austin was reversed 20 years later. So isn't it good to be still alive to see
yes,
that,
it is.
that happen?
Yeah, I remember the day we lost the case. Of course, the Solicitor General for the Attorney General had argued the other side, and we lost the case the day of his retirement party.
That was Louis Caruso.
And I said, as a professional, what a way to go out on top. This was a very important case nationally, and for him to win that on the day of his retirement must have really been satisfaction. I do remember arguing that case. One vignette, I went down there and spent almost a week just preparing. And then that morning, I wanted to be alone. So I went to the Supreme Court library, and I went way to the back, and I sat down, and there was hardly anybody in there. And I was back in the corner reading my briefs, and I looked up, and way in the other corner was Louis Caruso doing exactly the same thing. I said, now, that's a great scene. If you were doing a movie, you would show these two people getting ready for battle, both in this very ornate library, trying to get their arguments together, and we're going to be joined on the Supreme Court battlefield in an hour or so. And it was an interesting picture that I have in my head of that day. Not only, the other picture, of course, I had is the flop sweat I had as I had to stand up and argue about 5 feet away from the Chief Justice of the United States, who didn't think much of our argument at all, and we knew that. But
Although William Rehnquist kind of flipped a few years later in McConnell.
Yes, he did. That's right. But that day, we knew he was not on our side. So that was a great experience, and to have argued really your first appellate case in the United States Supreme Court is kind of an unusual experience. I actually went to my firm at the time, to the litigators, and I said, well, can I come down and meet with somebody who's argued in the Supreme Court, just so I can get an idea of what it's like? And they said, we have nobody. Most lawyers simply file attempts to get cases before the Supreme Court that are turned down. So very rarely is a case taken. And then nowadays, if a case is taken, you hire these specialists in the Supreme Court. So what I did back in '90 doesn't happen much anymore. A lawyer with a creative client like you that comes up with an idea, and we carry that ball all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, was unusual. The key thing about that case was that I like to talk about it is it was generated to raise these very issues at the highest level. And you came up with this idea of picking a special election, printing an ad that wasn't very high quality, saying that the chamber wanted to run this, but they were at risk of criminal prosecution, and therefore we were bringing this declaratory ruling. So it was based on real facts, and the court took it, and we were able to raise that next step. And the other thing that's important, if you're going to argue a case in the Supreme Court, you need to know where you fit in a series of cases. Anytime you're dealing with the First Amendment, or these most recent cases dealing with right of privacy, gay marriage, that sort of thing, you need to build on all the cases before that. And that's what you brought and we refined. The series of cases, it began to say there is such a thing as political speech. You can't restrict corporations from participating in ballot campaigns. You couldn't restrict certain other people. And we felt that this was the next step, a big step, to move toward allowing corporations to participate in independent expenditures, partisan on behalf of candidates. Another little story that I'll tell was during that argument, we met with all of the groups that had filed amicus briefs. And one of them was a group of the feminist groups, National Abortion Rights Action League, National Organization for Women. And I met with them, and they were very nice, and they had their lawyers doing their briefs. And they said, well, we're going to tell you the truth. We have tried to figure out a way for you to lose and us to win. Can we make an argument that we're more entitled to First Amendment rights, even though we're corporations, we're nonprofit corporations? But the Michigan Chamber was a nonprofit. And they said, we really tried, but we couldn't. So we're on your side. The ACLU was on our side. And so to me, that was interesting how these Supreme Court cases and these constitutional principles rarely break down on Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. And that's the trouble with reading the newspapers, if that's all you read. The press has to polarize everything and then report it only that way. And of course, then the people in the system need to do that too. So President Obama attacks the Supreme Court in a State of the Union speech on the Citizens United case. It's a very, very important decision, and the most recent one that just came down, also removing some of the limits. These are really just part of expanding political speech. And I've been involved in it for 50 years. I did an editorial in Papaw High School that they wouldn't publish in my school newspaper. The principal said, we can't publish that. So I just printed it up and I gave it to the teachers, and they handed it around in the faculty room where they would go smoke, because they agreed with me. And some of the other things that we have done over the years. I'm pretty consistent in saying that political speech is something that is kind of at the core of the First Amendment, and if you don't defend everybody's right, we see what happens in all of these other countries where they now are trying to crack down on the internet. be trying to crack down on the press, and it happens. And then we have some people in this country trying to do the same thing. When they argued the Citizens United case, the Assistant Solicitor General said, they asked him, well, does that mean the way, under your interpretation, they could ban a book that talked about Hillary Clinton before the election? And he said yes. So the Obama administration is not a particular fan of the First Amendment. And they have a lot of other people. That's why these fights are worth fighting, even if you're not terribly popular sometimes.
Now, you got a memento out of arguing a case before the United States Supreme Court. What did they give you?
Well, they give you a quill pen that I believe I lost. I always had it on my shelf, and I must have, when I moved, it's either in a drawer someplace or I didn't have it framed. If I'd won the case, of course, I would have had a framed picture of the holding and my quill pen, but we didn't win. It took 20 years for the court to issue the three most important words in my professional career. Austin is overruled. And when the court said that, you and I were vindicated. We were just 20 years early.
Well, let's move to another area, and that has to do with John Engler's election as governor. But before we get to John Engler's election as governor, let's go back to when he was still a state senator and as chairman of the campaign committee for Senate Republicans. You and he came up with the concept of the senatorial trust.
Right. We had the same issue of limitations. And therefore, John Engler, then Senator Engler, wanted to have a more coordinated campaign. He was unlike some of his predecessors. The Senate Republicans had been in the minority for years, and they were happy to stay in the minority. They just needed to elect their incumbents. John had a different view. He wanted to take over. So he wanted to raise more money, and they didn't have a real vehicle for it. There were no caucus committees then. Every committee was subject to these limits. So we came up with this model of a senatorial trust, which was similar to the COG. It was a system of committees that could work cooperatively, not unlike the AFL-CIO. I did a study of all the AFL-CIO committees. They're all in the same building, all had the same treasurer. They're all different from a legal point of view. And so we did that. And again, John wanted to win. So he spent some money to support Norm Schenkel in a primary. The kind of thing that you have to do if you're serious about taking control. Because if you have a weak primary opponent, wins the primary, then you have no chance to win. Unfortunately, Bob Vanderlaan, the Senate Majority Leader, didn't agree. He was more of the old minority view. We don't spend money in primaries. And he filed a complaint against John Engler and removed him from the Appropriations Committee, which was a huge insult and slap. And John Engler, I remember, and I went and we spent about 8 hours at Beggar's Banquet restaurant, which was kind of a political hangout then, and went through everything he did with the senatorial trust, with the campaign committee. And because I know all the laws, and we kind of went through everything, I figured you didn't do anything wrong. You had the authority, you did what was legally permitted. So I wrote a lengthy letter explaining all that. And that went away. It just went away because—
This was a letter to Vanderlaan?
It was not to Vanderlaan, to his lawyer.
Okay.
And Leo Farhat, prominent Republican who had always picked the judges in Ingham County for Governor Milliken, and a good guy, but and fortunately, Leo read that letter and said, "Oh well, I guess Vanderlaan is wrong. There's nothing wrong here." So, what always, a couple things surprised me. One is when John Engler took over as governor, Vanderlaan by then was a very prominent lobbyist, and John never held it against him. I would have just made that man's life unpleasant. But John Engler, like so many of the really good politicians, just they forget and they move on because they're heading someplace. But I did talk to John the night before he was sworn in. I remember sitting, I drove him home because I'd been the transition director, and we were sitting there and it was real cold, it was December 31. And I said, well, John, tomorrow you're going to be governor, and I'm going back to practice law because I wasn't going in the administration. And we just got talking about it, and I remember two things he said in that. He repeated what he has said many times. He said, well, George Romney told me to be bold. And he said, I'm going to be. He also said Governor Blanchard had really frustrated him because he wouldn't do things. I think after he lost control of the Senate, Governor Blanchard was somewhat shell-shocked, and John always felt there was more things that could have been done if they'd worked together, but they didn't. And then I asked him, I said, well, John, you're going to be at the peak of your power tomorrow. Accomplishments. I want to know the worst day in politics. And I said, I think it was when you got kicked off the Appropriations Committee. He said, absolutely. Because he had never won. He always defeated incumbents. That was the first time somebody sort of impugned his integrity. And really, to be removed from appropriations was, just not done. And that's why it reflects the kind of guy John Engler was. It happened. He went ahead. He got, Vanderlaan left the Senate. John was minority leader for a couple, 3 months, and then became the majority leader. And the Republicans have controlled the Senate ever since. And
30 years.
30 years. That's quite a undertaking. I remember I happened to be in Toronto when the Conservative Party fell after 42 years in Canada. And I was with Senator Art Miller. And the premier was named Miller. And we got to sit in on the vote for premier. We met with the premier, and he said, well, come on over and watch. It's my last day. And they go through this motion of no confidence and the new and to watch. And I think Senator Miller and it was just one of those historic periods where the Conservatives lost power. Now, they'd had to be in coalition governments, but 42 years, again, is a long time. And to run the whole government of the province. But that was an interesting time. And I remember one time also Senator Miller called me over. They're always trying to raise money. And he wanted me to give money to their caucus because I was a lobbyist and I had clients who would do it. I said, Senator, I will not do that. You know I won't do that. You're going to use that money to try to defeat Republican incumbents. You know I'm not going to help you do that because that would put John Engler out of a job. I said, on the other hand, I have to work with your people. And there's several of them I agree with. And I'll write a check to some of the incumbent Democrats that I work with and that I respect. I know you're going to that means you have to give them less money. I know that. John Engler knows that. But that's the way it is. And I remember Art Miller understood that.
You had a relationship with, John Kelly.
I had a relationship with John, now President Kelly, and now Ambassador Kelly. He was just named Ambassador, U.S. Army Reserve Ambassador, which is a program of the U.S. Army, and he's been put in charge of a big program, and I'm working with him on it. So John Kelly is another survivor over the years.
Were you at a meeting with John Kelly with the IRA?
We went to New York and had an apartment that Gordon Boardman's corporation had. And John Kelly was there, but he never would show up at our meetings. We had all these meetings with the Bank of Federal Reserve. We went out in the gold vaults, but he was just never there. And then we found out later he was meeting with his Irish friends, let me just put it. And I was never at a meeting with the IRA. In fact, I was never at a meeting with anybody Irish except John Kelly, John Francis Kelly.
Richard, let's return to 1990 and the gubernatorial election year. Did you think that John Engler was going to defeat Jim Blanchard?
I wanted him to, but I didn't think he would.
Had you, over the course of the campaign, talked at all about transition?
No, we really hadn't. I would go to brunch with him sometimes, he'd a little time off, and we'd just go And I would just say, John, tell me how you're going to win again, because he never wavered. But it was the night of the election. After the election, Wednesday night, we went to dinner with the Perot's and John and his new fiancée. And I said at the time, John, I'll do anything you want me to do now that you're governor-elect, except a job. I don't want a job. And the next day, Dan Perot, who became the chief of staff, and the governor-elect came over and they said, okay, we want you to be transition director. That was on Thursday. On Friday, we had our first meeting with the outgoing governor. So we all went over, and that was, as you might suspect, a very tense meeting. And I remember that we were waiting for Governor Blanchard to come in, and he came in and he said two things that I remember. He said, well, my staff thinks we should declare it a tie. He said, but John, you won. And then he also said, they just told me that Richard's going to be the transition director, and my people say they can trust him. And that was really a good thing to say, because after this acrimonious campaign, we then had to be an outgoing governor, an incoming governor, and we had to work together. So I was a transition director, and probably the most satisfying 2 months of my professional career in terms of helping a governor and a guy that I respected and liked put together an administration. We did some things that I don't think have been done before, but the National Governors Association has used in their new governor's school. One thing we did was we created probably the best law firm in the country. We got all the top lawyers who all agreed to help us do it. And we did research on, for example, every power of a governor under federal law. Nobody had put all that together. But John Engler wanted to know what his powers were. So Nancy Edmonds, now a federal judge, put together this report on powers of the governor. This business of reorganization of the executive branch that I had done on the governor's staff in 1972, a Blanchard official had stolen this memo from the archives and brought it over to me. I gave it to the governor-elect, and I said, John, this is what I've been talking about. You have more power than you think. Next day, he told me to go tell Bill Whitbeck that he had to stay after January 1st. He was my legal counsel for the transition. He had to go to work for the governor, a special counsel for reorganization. And from that came all of these reorganization of executive branch by the governor unilaterally under his executive authority that had never been done by Romney, by Milliken, or by Blanchard. So John started this complete rewrite of the remake of the executive branch. And of course it was challenged, and he had to go to court and get it approved. And the Supreme Court upheld everything he did. He almost never lost a case. Picking the cabinet was interesting because we would interview them, and the political, myself and others, and then we would turn them over to Pete Ellsworth, who would meet with them privately and ask the tough questions. You learn a lot of things. You learn how squeaky clean some people are, like Doug Roberts, who became state treasurer. And I remember telling Doug, there is nothing you have done wrong in your entire life that we can find.
That's because his dad was a Secret
Service man. There was others that you said, what were you thinking that you would turn in your resume? Well, I'm a Republican. I should get this job. And so we had a very interesting thing. One thing about the transition, we had a party Friday night, that night, and I was driving out to it at Kellogg Center. I said, oh my God, I'm going to be the second most popular guy here because I control the jobs. I don't control them, but I control the recommendations to the governor-elect. And I said I have to have a staff. I had no staff. I had no nothing. We had no office. I'm the transition director. So on driving out to the Kellogg Center, I came up with two names. I said I need a deputy and I need a legal counsel. Well, Bill Whitbeck had been my partner, and he was, quote, writing a book at the time, meaning he was unemployed. And then I thought of Carol Viventi. Carol had been the governor's secretary, and they had gone to law school together. And she was an Asian American, and she was a woman, and she was a lawyer, and she was clerk of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. So she knew the structure of government in somewhat the same way I did. I said she'd be a perfect deputy. By the time I got to that party, had 2 job offers already. And I said, no, you are not taking, with a lot more money. I said, you're going to go to work for the governor-elect, and you're going to be my deputy. And she was. So that period of time would be like 100-hour weeks. It was, very, very hard work, but to create an administration and to run and we had 2 sides of the building. We had the, inaugural proceedings, and that was another huge undertaking that you have to do. And one thing people forget is what happens when a new governor is elected. If he or she doesn't have, plans, and of course we had no plans, but we had a governor who'd been in government for 20 years. He had his own office in the Capitol. He had his staff. So we had it easier than most people. And interesting, some of the things that we did, first thing I did that weekend before Monday, I drafted a transition principles on ethics and confidentiality and all that. And some of those have been reprinted and used by governors ever since, because John Engler would go to the new governor's school every 2 years and give this lecture that I would help prepare. We'd dig out the old stuff we did. So things like operating principles. One of the principles was, if you're on the staff of the transition, you are never quoted in the press, period. Well, one young guy got quoted by some environmental newspaper up north. And we saw it. And he was driving back down, and I called him up and I said, you're off the transition team. He said, well, why? What did I do? I said, well, I saw your name in the paper. You talked to this editor. Well, I was just trying to get information of the transition. I said, no, that's not the rule. The rule is you're not quoted. And he was a young guy that worked for the Republican staff, and it was probably unfair to him. Well, it wasn't unfair. He broke the rule. But boy, everybody knew after that. McLellan meant what he said. The other thing they kept looking for was our hit list. They were confident that John Engler had a hit list of people. And I said, no. The only list we have is if you're a Democrat and you're unclassified, you're done. And I just sent a letter to all of them. There was another subset, and those were Republicans who had gone to work for Blanchard. And they had my special attention because, I just wanted to make sure they knew and everybody else knew. If you were a turncoat, you were gone. And a couple of them had the chutzpah to come over and think that it was an interview to stay in the job. And it wasn't. It included some good friends of mine, like Larry Meyer, who had been commerce director and had been one of my big clients. And fortunately, he had taken a leave of absence, and he was going back. And he knew it. He knew, so there was no problem with Larry, but there were some that didn't. So those are one of those great things of our political system. When John Engler left office, he really went out of his way to accommodate incoming Governor Granholm. That it didn't matter to him whether they agreed or didn't agree. He felt from an institutional point of view, he had an obligation to pass it along. And I think she did the same when she left office. So that's one of the better things in our highly partisan environment is gubernatorial transitions as well as presidential are part of the political system that you can be kind of proud of. Now, doesn't mean there are some people who are disappointed because they lose their job, especially if you work for Jim Blanchard and thought he was going to win. That's the tougher time. When Milliken left, when Granholm left, when Engler left, everybody knew they were leaving. Jim Blanchard, those people didn't think he was going to lose.
Well, he left scores of positions unfilled.
It really helped our present Attorney General because Governor Blanchard didn't fill the Ag Commission. Governor was able to fill it, and they picked Bill Schuette as the Ag Director. And so he then used that and is now our Attorney General.
Let's move ahead during the Engler years, and why don't we talk about two public policy issues that you were deeply involved in, and they, I think, both went to the state Supreme Court. The first was charter schools.
Well, charter schools, I was retained by Dr. DeWeese. He had a group called Teach Michigan that was proposing some school choice ideas, and he was paying me at the time. The governor comes in and he wants to do charter schools. They actually passed a charter school law that I never had read. And I read it and I said, this is completely unconstitutional. I mean, just, you're proposing things that don't make sense. And I asked Lucille Taylor, the governor's legal counsel, I said, Lucille, because they usually were very careful. The governor was a lawyer. Well, this was during Proposal A, when Proposal A was being considered. She just said, I just didn't have time to read it. And they signed it. So I went to the governor, and I said, this is unconstitutional, you have to do it again. Good news is, they decided to do it again. Dick Posthumus and some of the Democrats, including John Kelly, said, we want to take a Democratic bill and pass it so that we have a piece of charter schools. So I worked with the legislature, got it passed. I used the charter schools idea as an example as what's been fortunate for me, and that's the life cycle of legislation, public policy. I got in on the ground floor to draft that bill. I then had to help implement it, and I had Len Wolf, who was then a young associate in the firm, draft the first set of forms. And I said, Len, whatever you draft will be around forever. Because whoever does the first set of forms, everybody copies them. Then we got sued. And I said, well, now we have to defend the law. So to be able to write a law, implement the law, and then defend the law in the state Supreme Court and win, and then continue to represent people in the whole school change area is quite professionally satisfying. A lot of times lawyers only get a window on that process. But to have basically lived with that for all those years, and school choice continues to be a battle. I continue to be beaten up by the press trying to help the new governor on his school reform ideas, and he's taken them far beyond where Governor Engler was. And so public education and public schools and school choice, education choice continue to be a battle and will continue to be.
If you don't mind, I'd like to get a little personal. You first discovered that you had arthritis when you were 30, and you've lived now over 40-some years with that illness. But frankly, I think most observers know that you've lived a very, very full life, even with what could have been a very debilitating, disease. Would you like to comment on that?
I always say this, I'm lucky I'm a lawyer. If you just look at my hands, what if I was a bricklayer or a piano player? I'd be unemployed, but I'm a lawyer. All I have to do is move my mouth. And I type with 2 thumbs. And my secretary would laugh, and she'd say, I can't believe how fast you type. I said, well, I was a journalism student, and journalists just type with 2 fingers. I just had to switch to thumbs. And I will say that, and you hear this from other people that have much more severe disabilities than I do. Once you get it and accept it, it can, I don't want to say enrich your life, but it doesn't have to limit it, except in the ways that you do. I made a decision, and I think I told you this before. I was at a show, and there was a blind musician. And somebody asked him how it limited him as a blind musician. He said, well, it really doesn't. I treat my blindness as an inconvenience. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say it's an inconvenience. And even though I've had 10 operations and fixed all kinds of things, arthritis doesn't kill you. It limits you, particularly if you want to be a golfer or like I say, piano player. But for me, it has been just part of my life. And I also learned early on, people do not like whiners. They do not want to hear about pain that you have. And so why ever mention it? One day I was driving with my sister and she said, well, you never talk about how much it hurts, because my feet really hurt then. And she said, well, what's it like? I said, Mary, I never talk about it. But if you want to know, I'm going to tell you. I said, it's like I'm being strapped down on a table, and Dr. Mengele, the Nazi doctor, is walking in with a rusty ice pick and jamming it in the bottom of my feet. It hurts like that. She says, oh, I wish you hadn't told me. I said, that's why I never tell people. Because sometimes it used to be quite painful. It's really not now. And I was lucky. The first time I had my ankle fused, I had to go 6 months without weight bearing, and a friend of mine let me move into his house because he had a one-story house. He had 24-hour security. He had a cook and maids and all that, and it was the governor. So I lived for a month in the governor's residence. And I used to go to work on my little electric cart. So the CATA bus would pull up to the governor's residence, pick me up, take me to work. And about the third day, the bus driver said, "Excuse me, sir, who are you?" He said, "We don't normally come to this neighborhood. And we pick you up every day and we bring you back." And I said, "Well, I had this operation and I can't live at home. I live in a two-story house." And the governor and Michelle are friends of mine, and they said, "Well, we live in a one-story house and you can come over." And so I stayed there until I got a lift put in my house. So it is an inconvenience, and particularly when you're in a wheelchair and you're limited. But I just got back from Antarctica, and I took crutches when I'm walking on ice and so on. And so there's things that you can continue to do. I've met people with arthritis that have very, very severe, and they can be real role models for you, because you see, well, it's like, I think anybody has a limitation. You always find somebody that's got it worse. Then you can say, oh, okay, I can do this. If they can do it, I can do it. And I found many people over the years that do that. So yeah, I do have arthritis. It doesn't kill you. It's an inconvenience. I'm lucky I'm a lawyer and I live and practice, right in one town. And although I do travel a lot, I think that's one of the biggest challenges sometimes is traveling, because I like to travel and I do have limitations. But that's a quick summary of my arthritis.
Richard, I'm going to kind of wrap this up, but in some ways you remind me of that person in the Daseki commercial. You're the most interesting man in the world if we take a look at Richard McLellan outside of the practice of law and public policy. You've been to a lot of countries. You've been to, I think you're a tribal chief, if I remember correctly.
I am.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about being a tribal chief?
Well, in 1974, George Cushionberry was a 21-year-old legislator, and he introduced me to a guy named Obi Nwankwo, who was a Nigerian. This was during the oil embargo. So Obi convinced me that I could become a billionaire by going over to Nigeria and making tons of money. Well, I started to go to Nigeria, met a guy named John Umanyora, now His Royal Highness John Ezedirama Usadanima Umanyora, the Igwe of Obaniki. And I got interested in Africa. I got interested in West Africa, and over the years, I have been back to Nigeria a number of times. I went with Colin Powell to the elections. I also then got involved through Governor Engler with President Rawlings of Ghana, and have been to Ghana a number of times and have helped President Rawlings on some things. And then most recently, I got a phone call from His Royal Highness, who's the Nigerian, who said, "Would you go meet the president of Sierra Leone?" So I flew over there and met with the president of Sierra Leone for 2 days before I had to fly back and meet you to go to Havana. So I've been lucky to travel to Nigeria, to West Africa, represented the transitional government of Somalia. I also got to do elections. 1990, President Bush sent me to Bulgaria as the Soviet Union was unwinding, and I went 6 years later to the second Bulgarian presidential election, and then I did a Nigerian election. So 3 elections. I've been to Antarctica 3 times just because I'm intrigued with Antarctica. And I do like to travel, and I hope if I ever really retire, I'll get to do more.
The one story that I remember, and is that as a 10-year-old, maybe younger, you had a set of encyclopedias back in Pawpaw, and it had 18 volumes, and you started out reading each of those volumes.
Yeah. My father sold, and he lost his job and then ended up being an encyclopedia salesman. And of course, we bought the 1953 edition of World Book. And I'd never had a encyclopedia before. You know, you could go down to the library and look. But I started to read it, and it's just fascinating. And so I am kind of an information junkie, and thank God there was no internet back then. You know, who knows what I might have done. But I read it, and I remember just seeing the diversity of ideas and things that you need to know. And yes, so I read a large part of the World Book.
What struck me about that is that just, I think, illustrates that even from a young age, you've had this interest in a wide range of subjects. And even though one topic in the encyclopedia might be kind of boring, the next topic in the book might be totally fascinating. Yeah. And so what your career has shown is that you've developed this passion and this interest in a wide variety of issues, whether it's relates to charter schools or casino gaming or things like that.
I remember the day John Engler learned that Matt Engler, his father, had a brain tumor. He came right over to my house because he knew I had all these books on neuroscience and maps of the brain. And I said, you know, he knew that, and I knew that, but I didn't know anybody else did. But it was a kind of an interesting thing that he knew. He's not unlike me. He has a junk mind, and he would be interested in all kinds of things. But he knew that I had already been somehow interested in neuroscience because I'm interested in language. Then I'm interested in, so one thing leads to another, and you get into all these different areas, and that's what I have done my whole life. I hope to keep doing it for a while.
Let me conclude this by quoting a recent reporter who wrote an article about you, and I think she said something to the effect that Richard McLellan is perhaps the most influential person in public policy in Michigan who you've never heard of. Yeah. Well, the viewers of this particular program now have, I think, a pretty good knowledge of Richard McLellan. And Richard, thank you so much.
It's been fun. Thank you, Bob. It's been a fun talk.